taken in totality, something like 85% of the city budget is getting 15% or 20% of the coverage.
Right. And it makes sense that MPD would be 44% of,
just given how ridiculously scandal-ridden they are. Yeah.
if a disaster is going to befall Minneapolis, chances are MPD is at the root of it somehow. But I think it's an important point to make that city politics is bigger than the police department. Your city government is doing many more things.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. There's a budget hearing happening right now, so I'm glad that we had this scheduled so I don't have to watch the public hearing for the budget, which I feel like it's the same thing year after year.
Hey, anytime you need someone to flake on you, just let me know.
So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, are you ready?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. This is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards, and today the episode is about journalism, investigative journalism, accountability journalism, and my guest is Logan Carroll, who is a freelance journalist who has written for such publications as the Minnesota Reformer. And what else, Logan?
Sahan. I got a story in City Pages before it went down, so.
Oh, really? You've been around that long. You were in the old City Pages.
Oh, I mean, I think I was one of the last stories, actually. I think there were 4 or 5 after me. So that's cool. Racket.
So, yeah, we have Racket now. And we got together recently, and you were telling me all about your problems with the state of journalism today. And it took me a little by surprise because I'm thinking journalism locally seems healthier than it was a couple of years ago because we had Southwest Journal went down, City Pages went down. Now we have Racket and Southwest Voices and Minnesota Reformer and Sahan, and I'm probably missing some, but it feels healthier than ever in one sense of the phrase. But tell us what the problem is here that we're talking about today as you see it.
Yeah, so off the bat, like you're right, I think we're phenomenally lucky in Minneapolis to have Sahan, the Reformer, Racket, in addition to the more legacy outlets. Even Min Post, which I don't know if it counts as legacy. I think it's pretty close at this point if it's not. We're phenomenally lucky in a lot of ways. My problem is really around some holes I do see in local journalism, specifically around city politics coverage, city hall coverage.
So it's about accountability journalism is what it's about, and investigative journalism. Is there an important distinction between those two things, accountability versus investigative journalism?
Yeah, so for me, I've been frustrated with local politics coverage for a few reasons. I think we've all been I want to be careful here because I know there's a lot of people working really hard and talented people doing good work. But I think it's fair to say that we were all pretty disappointed in the Star Tribune's coverage of the last election. And beyond that, a lot of these publications that we have, that we're very lucky to have, don't really do coverage of city government. The Reformer's focus, the Minnesota Reformer, is part of the state's newsroom project. They're focused on the State House. They don't, I've been specifically told that they don't cover city politics except for the Minneapolis Police Department. Sahan, similarly, they're focused on Minnesota's communities of color. Stories of communities of color and of importance to them. They're ideally, I think they're focused on the entire state. In practice, they tend to be focused on the metro area for the most part, but they don't do a lot of city news coverage. Racket, I am less familiar with, but you get similar issues with NPR and MinPost. There's this focus on the State House, which is important, and they're doing good work, but for reasons that I'd love to talk about at some point today, city politics just gets completely overlooked. Well, not completely, but is not nearly as robust as the coverage of the State House, even though we are very lucky here. So for me, a real turning point was the sort of that incident with the Division of Race and Equity several months ago, where staff at the Division of Race and Equity put out a public letter accusing the city of having a very toxic work environment, toxic and racist work environment. And I read the letter that they put out. I don't know, I think we talked about this when we met. You tried to read the letter.
There was a lot of long letter and like lots of supporting documents, and it takes a while to like get to the meat of the issue.
Page 16 to 21, I think it was, before you get to a specific piece of information. But when you get to it, the majority of their complaints were around public safety efforts that were getting stonewalled with racism. I've got, there was the, sorry, I'm pulling up my notes here.
We have a child interrupting the podcast in the background.
You can hear that, huh?
Mm-hmm.
How bad is that sound? Is it?
It's fine. I'm just
okay. Yeah, he's. You'd never even tell he's been like sick for 2 months. He's just all energy. It's been.
I'm glad he's back to health.
Yeah,
full health.
Okay, so some of the things that were in the letter when you got through it, again, page 16. The staff talked about, they were working on implementing an ordinance that would prevent landlords from evicting tenants who were victims of crime, which it's crazy that that's legal. And while they were working on that, a white crime prevention specialist questioned a black race and equity staff member's education, amongst other things. There was the concern by staff that the city did not speak to the Division of Race and Equity at all, even for past context, after Amir Locke was killed by the Minneapolis police. And while working to institute unarmed public safety responses, the former 911 director, Kathy Hughes, refused to work cooperatively with race and equity staff, that was their language, going so far as to question one staff member's ability to pass a background check. And in the end, black staff realized they had to, and this is a direct quote, filter all communication through a white staff. Now, what was frustrating to me is when I read the coverage, it was all about going back to work for COVID. The public safety angle, I didn't see it in any stories.
Right.
And I couldn't sell the story when I tried to write it. It feels very relevant. And it felt to me like here's a big story that's very important, at the forefront of what everybody cares about, that gets into the sort of the nitty-gritty, some of the bureaucracy around public safety reform that the public needs to know about. That is the essence of city politics, and the story just got missed, in my opinion.
Right.
And so I've had sort of vague concerns with city politics coverage for a while, and when that happened, I decided to look into it, see really are there holes in the coverage of city politics? If so, what are they? Why are they there? And what can we do about it? And so to that end, I sort of binged 6 months worth of city politics coverage in 5 publications. It was the Star Tribune, Minnesota Reformer, Sahan Journal, MinPost, and NPR.
Before we get into that, it's more important than ever to understand how city government is working, because we have just shifted to a new a new system of government with completely different players. We've shifted the center of power from the legislative to the executive branch, from the city council to the mayor. And so it's working in a completely different way. Explaining how it works is more important for local journalism than ever.
Yeah.
And I can't say I have a good grasp on it as somebody who like pays attention all the time. I tend to take like Lisa Goodman's theory of the case, but it's very simple.
Blame the mayor, because he's in charge.
Right? Blame the mayor. As you can tell, my preparation for this episode was just preparing that soundbite to play.
That's great.
And so my job is done now. And also,
Well,
we
let me
didn't
tell
introduce
you right
you
now-
fully.
let
You
me-
were the
Oh, yeah.
third place finisher for a journalism award, weren't you?
Yeah, for investigative journalism from the Minnesota Society of Professional Journalists. I'm pretty proud of it.
Did you get a
place, but
third place trophy, or were you just like third place in the rankings? How did
third
that
place certificate in an
Okay,
envelope.
so it's a legitimate award across the whole state. Logan Carroll finished in third place.
First place is
for-
up for the Pulitzer. First and second
Yeah.
place were teams of staff writers, and I was a solo freelancer, so I was really proud of that. I was pretty proud of that.
And I don't want to get too deep into it, but it was about how like our former chief Arredondo was like basically doing commercials with outside political actors, and my favorite part was how Bill Rodriguez, the guy who was running the Facebook crime page, didn't actually live in Minneapolis, and you couldn't find evidence that of a home invasion a story he kept telling. You couldn't find evidence of that. So
He later admitted to the Star Tribune that he lied about it. Or
Yeah.
no, that he lied about where he lived. I don't know about... I mean, but his story was that he lived in this house, and he admitted that he lied about living there, so...
right.
Yeah, that was a fun one
Let's
to
get
write.
into your survey, because I was very impressed that you consumed so much news.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
This takes a lot of work to read that much news and document what you found. So let's get into what you found looking at 6 months worth of local news.
Yep, from February 1st to through the end of July of 2022. So at post-election, but it covers the killing of Emir Locke. It covers the Division of Human Rights, or the Department of Human Rights report on the MPD. It covers the transition to the strong mayor system. There was stuff happening. It wasn't sleepy. And
Yeah, city politics is more in the news than it has ever been, I feel like. So, yeah.
And yet, having read 6 months, binging 6 months of city politics coverage, I don't understand city politics better than I did when I started. There are a few exceptions, but on the whole, everything just sort of like, the stories just kind of float out there. It's just this body of disconnected information, just people doing things. Today they did this. Then the next day that's completely forgotten. Today we did this. Jacob Fry repeatedly, falsely claimed to have banned no-knock warrants. This, in my opinion, should reflect on the man's credibility and should continue to reflect on it. It seems not to in the press. With very few exceptions, which we'll get to. I think there were some really good pieces of journalism done in this time period, but they were extremely in the minority. When we started, you were talking about the accountability journalism, investigative journalism. Quick description of what those terms mean might be in order?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Yeah.
a lot of the framework for what I was doing here, both sort of like the specific actually doing the survey and some of the ways I did it, which I want to stress that wasn't scientific in the least. It's not. This is just me looking at it and seeing what I can see, and taking some notes on it. But the structure of what I did, as well as sort of like the way I thought about it, was really informed by this book called The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, which is a terrible title, but it's a great book about the failures of journalism in the lead up to the Great Recession. And in that book, the author, who is Dean Starkman, sort of draws a distinction between two different kinds of journalism. One he calls access journalism, the other accountability. Now, the access journalism tends to be it's shorter stories, it's quicker, it's the news of what happened yesterday. The point of view, sort of the sources of information, are very top down, with lots of officials and people who are inside the room making decisions. It tends to be just the facts. It relies on that insider information, and because it relies on insider information, journalists have to maintain relationships with their sources, and this skews the news. It's not bad in and of itself. They're really important stories that get told that way, and we need that kind of journalism. But there's a lot of stories it misses. And the other kind of journalism that Starkman identifies as accountability journalism, which tends to be longer pieces. They're very time and resource intensive. They take a very long view of history. They look back. They're very backwards facing. The sources tend to be ground up. Citizens, victims of fraud, things of this nature. It makes a moral judgment. It's sort of founded on the idea that someone has done something wrong, and that requires a moral judgment. It identifies a problem, and it names a guilty party. And not all of these are present all the time. It is sort of a template, a pattern, an ideal that, not every story falls neatly into one or the other, but generally these are sort of what Starkman says are like these two contrasting forces in journalism that are really pulling against each other, that can complement each other at the best, but really are fighting against each other. And the other term he talked about, investigative journalism, it's a kind of accountability journalism. Starkman even equates it with accountability journalism, but I'm using that word when I use it. I'm talking about very in-depth investigations. So, for instance, a good example is that Department of Human Rights report about the MPD that came out. There was lots of news about it, and it was accountability. People were saying, "Here's a problem with the MPD." But I don't think it was really investigative. They're just reporting on a report that somebody else wrote. So I draw a distinction between that and say there was this, hands down, the best article that I read in that 6 months. The, without a doubt, best was this piece by Randy First for Star Tribune, where he looked at the phenomenon of police officers filing PTSD claims. And he just identified the hell out of it. I think we all, when that was happening, the city's paying out millions of dollars in payments to cops who say they have PTSD, and a lot of them. I think we all thought fraud at some point in our head.
Right.
And
They're all using the same lawyer, and
yeah.
it just...
And Randy First began with that, and then he just reported the hell out of it and identified all the red flags, talked to all the experts in labor law and disability law, and really collected the receipts on this really looks like fraud. That is investigative journalism. Very in-depth, very long period. It took a very long view of the problem. So when I use those terms, that's what I'm talking about.
And so it's very expensive. You're
Yes.
doing data requests. You're waiting a long time to get that back from government agencies.
And you're picking fights with people who have lots of money usually, so you get sued. It happens.
Yeah.
Eventually. It's expensive.
And it's not about like a single event. As you say, it's going back in time, reviewing public records, talking to a lot of people. So the cheap and easy thing to do is cover the events of the day, and you will produce a lot of stories that way, which are important. Like, I think it's useful to note this person said this and did this on this day, so we can look back and see if that matches what they're currently saying about how they have behaved in office. So it's not to denigrate the work that the people are doing day to day. These are all important stories. And there's an element of economics in this too. It's expensive to produce this work.
It's expensive. There's another really good book called, well, again, terrible name, Democracy's Detectives. It's about the economics of investigative journalism, where one of the points the author makes is that investigative journalism, you can make it work on the national scale. Just the economies of scale work out that you can make money on it at the national level. That's it. So yeah, I was starting to
That's what I'm finding out about having a podcast on the neighborhood scale. Yeah, the economics don't work.
I know. I'm impressed. You've been going at it. And you're so consistent. It's hats off.
Should we get into your findings?
Yeah, happy to do it.
Let's do it. And we should say for listeners, let's try to make it good for listeners because the vast majority of people will be listening to this. But if you wanted a premium experience, you can go to YouTube and see the slideshow with all the charts.
I put a lot of work into this data visualization. Go to YouTube.
YouTube.com/WedgeLive.
This is all the stories I looked at. I read 267 stories. And the first takeaway is that the Star Tribune dominates city politics coverage by a very wide margin.
Which is probably a reflection of just their sheer size and the people they can throw at the personnel they can throw at city politics. Minpost, for example, I think you told me they only have one person who sort of covers the city.
I don't know if that's true exactly. The overwhelming majority of their city politics coverage was by Solomon Gustavo. Yeah. So I don't know that he's the only one, but he is definitely their primary one.
Minnesota Reformer, I think you said, doesn't really do city coverage aside from MPD.
Nope.
NPR, I can't say I've seen a ton of city government coverage from them. So this kind of is consistent with my impression that 83% of city politics coverage among the outlets that you reviewed, which doesn't include Racket and a few others, but
Spokesman Recorder. I think Racket and Spokesman Recorder are the two very big gaping holes in this survey.
And I think the reason for this is like the Star Tribune will cover like small things, those day-to-day things, like this has been approved at the Planning Commission, for example, which you probably won't see at Minpost. You definitely won't see in the Reformer, won't see at NPR. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So see, Star Tribune dominates the city politics coverage. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do to sort of objectively analyze the coverage was to sort of compare, when I built this database of all these stories, I was tracking what city officials were the subjects of stories and what departments were the subjects of stories. And then I wanted to compare that to the city budget. So this is expenditures by city department in Minneapolis. So for those listening, there's a few big takeaways here that I want to point out. That Public Works is 25% of the budget by itself. City Coordinator is 18%. Capital Improvements is 13%, which, and then the MPD is 12.5%. So these are the four biggest ones. Capital Improvements, I couldn't quite figure out what that was.
So that is like sewers and
I think it's
infrastructure projects, buildings.
I think it's Public Works.
Right, but there's a public works section of the budget, capital improvements. I think it's really shameful that neither of us know the answer to this.
But I mean, it's shame. Is it though? I mean, like, how do you find it out? You don't learn it in the news. Where do you learn it?
So the city, for example, built a new city office building. I believe that would go into the capital improvements section.
Yeah, my point though is I believe that's still Public Works though. It's just, I don't know if it's a different bucket.
So there's a municipal buildings commission. I don't know that city buildings fall into Public Works. Sewer stuff, street stuff, that's Public Works.
Okay. Well, moving on though. So this is where we begin with. Let's focus on those three. Public Works, 25% of the budget. City Coordinator, 18%. MPD, 12.5%. And then we look at what Minneapolis looks like in the news. And the MPD just sucks up all the oxygen in the room. 44% of stories were about the MPD. While, the city council got 10% of stories were about the city council. And stories could be about multiple things. And then the mayor's office was 25%. And the elected officials, that makes sense. They are a minuscule part of the budget. There's these really tiny little sliver pie slices here on the budget chart that they're so small they're not even labeled. And 2 of them are the mayor and the city council. But it makes sense that we'd want a lot of stories about elected officials that are much bigger than the share of the budget that they get. I'm not saying that like this should map 100% onto the city budget, but it helps us understand a couple of things. Like I said, MPD is eating up all the oxygen in the room. And the second thing is that something like 85% of the budget in Minneapolis gets just at about 20% of the coverage. What this tells me is that journalism, the press, the local press, is not helping citizens understand how their city government works or the shape of it. That's my big takeaway. For instance, Public Works, which was 25% of the budget, was just 2.4% of the stories. And the other one,
let me throw some skepticism at you.
Okay.
So Public Works is like delivering water to your house and charging either your landlord or you personally for that. And so like a lot of what Public Works spends is on like very routine infrastructure things like the roads you drive on and the water you drink. And so as long as the water is clean, right? We're not Flint, Michigan. We're Minneapolis. We have the cleanest water in the world. We're probably not smart to devote a ton of resources investigating a lot of what Public Works does, which is why that number is so high.
The flip side of that, you may be right about Public Works. That could very well be true. But one of the major takeaways of that book that, again, sort of formed the framework for how I approach this, one of the big takeaways was that, in short, the reason the press missed the financial crisis, the Great Recession in '08, was because they trusted technical experts who were just sort of siloed way off on the side, doing their thing, completely out of view of everyone. Now, this is not going to be another financial crisis. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form, but there is some sort of a parallel here to the technical experts in the city who are just sort of siloed off on their own, sure, doing the routine thing. We all trust that they're just doing the routine thing. But where's the generalist who's just poking their head through the door? Is that what Public Works is doing? What are their priorities? The word politics literally means the affairs of the city. This budget, this is city politics. This is what? How many staff does the city have? I had it in my notes at some point. It's like 1,000 or 1,500?
I would get, are we including MPD? Because MPD by itself has, 500 or so, 550 patrol. I mean, it has to be in the many thousands.
Yeah.
Please
Every
don't
one of
embarrass me
those
by
people,
asking me specific questions like this.
Whatever it is, but every one of those people is making dozens of decisions every day about how resources get used. This is the affairs of the city. This is city politics. What Public Works is doing, routine or not, that's politics. That's the affairs of the city. That is being driven by ideas about what is the priorities of the city, what they should be, and therefore what they are. And
I mean, in a sense, it's...
No, I don't care about... Oh, go ahead, excuse me.
I'd love to see more Public Works stories and like more in-depth Public Works stories, because when you have a story about a street reconstruction, which is maybe the biggest, most expensive projects near to people's homes that a city can do, it's always very shallow, like neighbors are making up some bullshit about trees that will be cut down in order to oppose a bike lane. And it's very like NIMBYs versus people looking to the future kind of. It's the story that's always written.
Let me reiterate one thing I said, which is that this chart that of what Minneapolis looks like in the news, I do not believe that should map 1-for-1 onto the city budget. I do not believe that. I'm not saying 25% of city coverage should be about public works, but taken in totality, something like 85% of the city budget is getting 15% or 20% of the coverage.
Right. And it makes sense that MPD would be 44% of,
just given how ridiculously scandal-ridden they are. Yeah.
if a disaster is going to befall Minneapolis, chances are MPD is at the root of it somehow. But I think it's an important point to make that city politics is bigger than the police department. Your city government is doing many more things.
Another thing to think about here is that no one of these charts says anything of importance. I don't want to get too hung up on any one piece of detail. I think it's best to sort of go through it all and then sort of look at it in its totality. And so this is a data point. This is just one thing to keep in mind. And I want to add a little bit of a nuance to this, too, is that when I say, for instance, when you're looking at this map, this is the chart of Minneapolis news coverage, 0.4% of the stories were about the city assessor. Now, that equals one story. One story was about the city assessor's office. And that does not mean that, one story was exclusively about it. This story, for instance, the headline reads, 3 Minneapolis department heads approved, disputed city coordinator decision postponed. This is a Star Tribune story from May 26th, 2022. This story is 12.5% of all the coverage of the city coordinator's office. It is 25% of the coverage of both CPED and reg services, and it is 100% of the coverage of the assessor's office. Which, you break it down by budget, that means this one story is watchdogging something like $26 million of the city's budget. It's 590-word story, which means that every word of this story is trying to keep an eye on $44,500. Again, these are just data points. I don't disagree with what you were saying about public works. I'm not saying that we need, an in-depth analysis of the assessor's office. It would be nice to know what they do.
We do. Because it's a lot in the news lately about racial disparities in how properties are valued, whether it's private actors who go in to estimate the value of a home before you're going to purchase it, and if they see a black family in that home, it gets tremendously undervalued, which affects their ability to sell that home for a fair price. And on the tax side, there's a question of, so property houses in North Minneapolis have increased in value at a much higher rate than in other parts of the city, and there are reasons for that. But that's a very interesting story in terms of how the assessor's office does their jobs, because it affects the taxes people pay for all these other services on your pie chart here.
Exactly. So I went back to this pie chart. This is the city budget, broken down expenditures by department. Again, this is politics. What you're talking about there, with the city assessor's office, that's politics. That's the affairs of the city. Those are political decisions about where to direct the resources of the city and how to shape the city. And as you said, it was getting pointed in a way that could be described as white supremacist, racist, disparate at the very least. Now, the other thing about these stories is that, just because a story was about a city department doesn't mean the coverage really helped you understand city politics at all. This story, which is another Star Tribune story, the headline is, Minneapolis housing inspectors have cruised 1,200 miles on e-bikes. This is another 25% of the coverage of reg services between February and July 2022.
I enjoy this story, Logan. Why are you trashing e-bikes? I
Hey.
love that Minneapolis housing inspectors have cruised 1,200
I'm not
miles on
trashing.
e-bikes.
I'm not trashing e-bikes. That's
I
great.
love
That's
I love
great.
that the city is being green by letting their housing inspectors ride e-bikes. That's
Sure,
not a thing
wonderful.
that other cities do. This is an important
How do you
story.
feel about it being 25% of the coverage of reg services?
That's probably out of whack somehow. But I don't like that
Potentially.
you're besmirching e-bikes and cruising 1,200
Don't put
miles
words
on
in
them.
my mouth. Don't put words in my mouth. When I besmirch e-bikes, you'll know it.
Okay, you are correct that 25% of the news coverage of reg services between February and July
Yeah.
probably shouldn't have been an e-bike story.
But,
But I do
it-
love the e-bike story.
again, though, no one of these slides really says much of importance by itself. I think you kind of got to look at the total picture altogether. So that was sort of the first thing I did, was sort of this cognitive mapping. How does the news present just the shape of the city? And I think it's fair to say that we identified some potential problems, some potential holes in the coverage, right? So the next thing I wanted to look at was who gets quoted about city politics coverage. Because again, going back to that difference between access journalism and accountability journalism, one of the major differences was about who are the sources. And this cover, overwhelmingly, the people getting quoted are officials. Over a third of all quotes, or all the people quoted over this 6-month time period, over a third of them were Minneapolis city officials. The next closest was nonprofits at, let's see, let me back up here really quick. 364, Minneapolis public officials were quoted 364 times. Nonprofits were quoted 104 times. The largest group of nonprofits was business and industry. It was the Downtown Council and the Chamber of Commerce. Those were the largest group of nonprofits.
So on this, are business and industry, is there overlap between some of these categories? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, again, this isn't super scientific. I think what this would do, this would be a really great preliminary survey to build a study around, a more rigorous study. So there are some flaws. So for instance, the business and industry, that's not necessarily bad. The biggest category in business and industry was small businesses. They were the most represented. But the other things, some other points about this, business and industry was 5.7% for those listening of quotes came from business and industry. 8% of quotes came from Minneapolis city residents, which was the third largest category. Another problem with this is that the majority of those quotes from residents came from testimony at public hearings that not even 100% sure the journalist was at the meeting. They may have just watched the
That's my
recording.
bread and butter. Is quotes from residents at public meetings. Don't do not besmirch the idea of quoting people from a live stream. That is the way to do it.
I'm just like going after all your favorite things, aren't I?
Yes. Also, another problem with only quoting people from public hearings type stuff is, who shows up to public hearings? Old white people who are very upset about the world changing. So,
I agree. So
so you didn't break down in your chart the number of residents quoted from like a public hearing as opposed to like going out into the world and finding someone?
it didn't occur to me to do that until I was about halfway through and I realized how many of the people were at public meetings.
It's also not always entirely clear where the person was found, so you could read a story and not realize necessarily. Like maybe it was a story about a public hearing or an issue where a public hearing happened, and then they quote a person, and you don't quite know. I see that a lot in like TV news stories where I'm not quite sure, was this at the public hearing? So it's not always possible to even find that distinction.
So the fourth largest group was police, which was majority Minneapolis police. So what I take from this is that this chart here shows an overwhelming reliance on official sources, and it underrepresents the extent to which they are, if anything, it underrepresents the extent to which official sources are the sources for local politics stories. I do not believe it overrepresents it. So, who gets quoted the most about city politics?
Am I a stand-in for the listeners? Am I going to guess? Do I get to guess?
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
I guess I
I
already
think
revealed. I already did the reveal.
It's Mayor Fry.
It's Mayor Fry.
Definitely Mayor Fry.
Which, maybe that makes sense. But
Wait,
10%...
let me play my Lisa Goodman sound clip.
Blame the mayor, because he's in charge.
That's why he's quoted the most.
Yeah. Lisa Goodman, while we're speaking of her, one of the longest serving people in the city, definitely the longest serving elected official, one of the most influential people at City Hall, quoted 3 times in the 6-month period.
Did you break out? I hate to ask you this because you did all this labor for free, but did you break out by which council member? Was there a council member who stood out as being quoted a ton? Somebody who didn't get quoted at all?
It was, Andrea Jenkins. She's the council president. That makes sense. Robin Wansley.
Firebrand. That makes sense.
And there was something a little that left me feeling a little disquieted, I guess, or that made me a little uncomfortable, was that it was fairly common, not in every story, but it was fairly common to use, Robin as the voice of the opposition, to have her represent lefties in a story, or the lefty viewpoint. Elliot Payne, Jason Chavez, and Jeremiah Ellison, to a lesser extent, served a similar function. But again, you have like this. We'll talk about that in a second. But that kind of left me disquieted too. Was the way people get presented in stories. And there's nothing wrong with using Robin to be that voice of opposition. She is, in a lot of ways. But she was one of the only voices. Elected officials were like the only voices of, skepticism of the, what would you call it, the mayor and his coalition.
So part of this is you're getting into like who is willing to call you back, and it's like, how do I make my job as a journalist easy? It's the person that I've called a bunch and who will call me back because I have to write this story by this time, and I can't go around searching for new people. I'm going to talk to the person I always talk to.
It's access journalism.
And who is willing to talk to me also? Like, okay, this person I know is reliable, will get back to me. And so...
Now... just do a quick shout out to Andy Mannix. He comes to mind as somebody who had a story where he was just out there talking to small business owners, and just got out on the streets and talked to them. And that was and there were a couple other people who did that. There was this phenomenal, another one of the best stories I read was by, and I've only seen her name written, so I might mispronounce it, I apologize, but Faisa Mahmoud at the Star Tribune did a story where she spoke to a bunch of residents of an encampment that had just been evicted, and was there for it, and spoke to the people on the street. And let me come back to that when we get back to it, because I'll come back to the story. But I want to stress that there is some... You talk about like the economics of it. You talk about the pressures... to do stories that are quick turnaround, who's going to call you back? There's some journalists who are working under tremendous constraints who are still doing really great work. I'm not here to denigrate anybody, and I really want to stress that point very extensively. But then you get to this question of who's not getting quoted. And one of the biggest gaps was around public safety reform, in my opinion. Now, let me walk you through what I mean here. Is that yes for Minneapolis, that coalition, that group that was really behind the Question 2, the public safety amendment that would have replaced the Minneapolis Police Department with the Department of Public Safety, they got more, that question got more votes than Jacob Frye. They got more votes than Jacob Frye. They could credibly be said to represent nearly half of Minneapolis on one of the core issues. And individuals who were from Yes for Minneapolis or from member organizations were quoted on the issue of police reform just 3 times in 2 stories. So there's this left perspective that's being, by and large, omitted, that just doesn't appear in the press. So the people who got quoted the most about public safety and police reform were Michelle Gross, or Communities United for Police Brutality, who were quoted 8 times, or in 8 different stories. Nikema Levy-Armstrong, who was quoted in 7 different stories. And I put Lisa Clemens in here just to round out. She wasn't one of the most... Actually, she was one of the most quoted individuals, even though she was on the lower end of that. Who was quoted 3 times.
She, as an individual, was quoted... I'm surprised it's only 3, because I see Lisa Clemens in local news stories a ton.
Uh-huh.
And your point about the Yes on 2 versus...
Because...
the thing that I find most compelling is Nikema, when she is presented as Mayor Frye has this team of rivals, and did Nikema oppose Jacob Frye? I don't remember that happening. Did that happen? I believe she's on the same side as him.
She ran against him in 2017.
Okay, well that was in 2017.
Yeah.
But I feel like journalists are remembering that and not everything that happened after that election, where, as far as I could tell, these people are on the same team politically, as much as Nikema can be on anyone's team, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that they're, I don't know that they're all on the same team or not, but I think that it's fair to say that they represent a similar viewpoint. Every one of these women was publicly opposed to Question 2, which means that they could credibly be said to represent the opinions of a little over half of Minneapolis. I'm not saying they shouldn't be here. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with opposing Question 2. But what I'm saying is that you're not getting a full picture of the different opinions and viewpoints on this issue. And there is a gross and profound imbalance skewing in one direction. And that's a problem.
Right. And whether it's intentional or not, whether these people just happen to be very likely to return your calls, there's an imbalance here.
Yeah. So the next question was just, and this is pretty minor, but how long are stories about city politics? This is overall. This is across all 5 publications. You can see that the majority... a little over 3/4 are less than 1,000 words, which is pretty short.
Is less than 1,000 words pretty short? My attention span is shot.
Yeah,
I think if you did this chart...
It's not, embarrassing.
If you did this chart about Wedge Live, all my tweets would be under 500 words. All my tweets about city politics.
You do an hour-long podcast.
Oh, okay, that's true.
A little over 1,000 words. And there's nothing wrong with doing a short story. But
especially when most people just read the headline. I feel like word count is overrated. It depends. You can pack a lot of information into a small package. And that's the definition of being a good writer, especially in this age of diminished attention spans.
And yeah, so again, it doesn't really mean, this one slide doesn't mean anything on its own. Just because Star Tribune is such a large part of it, this is how long city politics stories are in the Star Tribune. They're shorter on average. I think it's, on average, 768 words long across all publications and 725 words in the strip. So not, they're 83% of the coverage or whatever. So the takeaway for me on this, though, is that, again, one of the differentiations between this access journalism and accountability journalism is about word count. That accountability stories tend to be longer. I mean, they have to be. I mean, you've just put a ton of time and work and energy into it. Like, why not do it, go long, go big?
Right.
Second, like, you're picking fights with people. You're saying there's a problem and you're saying somebody's at fault for it. So you really need to cover your bases. Right. So for me, my takeaway on this is not that there's a problem with this in and of itself, but it's just a data point that tells you in which direction the news is skewed, especially taken alongside the chart about who's getting quoted. We have city officials predominantly getting quoted in predominantly shorter stories that don't go in depth. There's just not enough time to push back on the official story,
So your survey of word count here, it looks like you looked at 267 total stories. 8 of them were longer than 2,000 words, which are going to be the stories hopefully packed with lots of context and detail and hard work. And
most of those were online. Online stories just tend to be longer. The Star Tribune only had one that was over 2,000 words, which the other big takeaway for me on that is that, like, they are not producing many feature stories about city politics. They're producing some. And again, that Randy First story, that was the one that was over 2,000, it was that brilliant piece of investigative journalism by Randy First. It was so good. But those are the exception. And I'll tell you the other thing about that Randy First story, as good as it was, there was no follow-up. He assembled just this laundry list of red flags that there is widespread fraud being committed. And then the story died. There was no push by the newspaper. You invest all that time and effort and energy into producing that story, you'd think they'd want to get legs out of it. You'd think they'd want to really push the story, push the fact that this looks like widespread fraud.
Although, like, at a certain point, you've pointed out the problem, and the only thing that you can do as a reporter is just say, well, if the prosecutors won't do anything, if governmental authorities won't hold anyone to account, I've told the story. Like, what else do I do aside from posting my story on Facebook every day and say, hey, remember when I did this? Look at this.
Except that, like, one of the fundamental purposes of the press is to convene a public forum. It's not simply about providing information. It's about being the place where people have these debates. It's about setting the agenda. This is why you want to talk to a lot of different people from a lot of different perspectives, is because that's what the press does. They set the agenda for the public. To an extent, you're right, along with elected officials and the public. It's like, it's not, and activists, I think, especially, again, going back to that Watchdog That Didn't Bark book, those are the 3 legs that he identifies in, driving change and holding wrongdoers to account, or, and interpret that broadly. But the press does have a role to play, and the press can create this. What I'm seeing in here, because, again, that really good Faisa Mohamud story, where she interviewed all these residents of an encampment whose account directly contradicted the official account, there was no follow-up on that one either. These stories just sort of disappear. Again, it's the news of what happened yesterday. And already, there are major red flags that the city got fleeced for millions of dollars of fraud. Like, that's fraud. Like a giant fraud scheme.
Right.
And the story just disappears.
So what is the solution? How do we make it better?
There's one pattern that I noticed that I thought was very interesting. It's not especially meaningful in and of itself, but I think it illustrates a point I want to make. When I was reading city politics coverage, especially in the Star Tribune, there were a handful of stories that got videos. They were all about the MPD. There was a listicle or 2 that the Star Tribune wrote, again, about the MPD. These are very online formats, video listicles. There's a couple other explainer pieces. Because the NPD is a national story. And again, the economies of scale work out that you can justify investing that. The video and this is my hypothesis, this is my assumption of it. Because we know, again, going back to that book, Democracy's Detectives, we know that market forces, economic concerns, shape the kind of journalism that can happen.
Right.
And nothing wrong with doing a video or a listicle. I just think it illustrates rather clearly one instance of these sorts of market forces shaping journalism. Not even necessarily in a bad way.
It's also the case that the Star Tribune's suburban readership doesn't want stories about the broader context for the situation in Minneapolis. They want short, quick stories about MPD and plummeting staffing levels and, oh, what a bad place Minneapolis is. There's no way to sell contextualized stories to their suburban readership. It's not a moneymaker.
And, going along with that, I just saw a statistic the other day that for the first time, maybe ever, subscriptions outpaced advertising as the major source of revenue for news outlets. Not bad. It's just a fact. There's journalism that doesn't happen because of the market. I think we need a publication that's completely outside the market. Or not a publication. We need journalism that's free, that's outside of all these pressures. Again, I think the only way you could do that then is fund it through philanthropy, which in and of itself, that would shape the kind of journalism that you can do. But it would cover some of these holes. It would have holes that are being covered by now. It would complement what's already there.
So are you saying you have a big idea to write a grant proposal to some big nonprofit and get something funded? Have you fleshed out your idea? Is that what you're on here to sell?
That's what I'm on here to sell. Yeah. Here, let me get the can. Just right here. New and improved.
It sounds like something someone would or should throw money at, but I don't know. I don't know who will. Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of work to try to make it happen.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping people who are interested in it will reach out to me after they see this. I firmly believe that journalism is a community project, that it's not just like a journalist out being some wizard. I don't know. That's
how I think of myself, as out there being a wizard.
Hopefully that makes up for the e-bikes and public meeting slamming that I've done tonight. Man, I kind of got off track there.
So we're not wizards.
We're not wizards.
Journalists are not wizards.
That it needs to be a collaboration with the community, and I very specifically don't mean Patreon. I'm not talking about funding it through that source. There's this another really great book that really informed me while I was working on this was a collection of stories by Wayne Barrett, who is a Village Voice investigative reporter who really got a ton of attention right after Trump got elected because he was covering Trump since the 70s. And in the introduction to the book, which was written by one of his proteges, who's like a really accomplished investigative journalist in her own right, she's talking about like why he was able to do this phenomenal, wonderful investigative journalism. And one of the points she made was that, he was able to do this because he didn't have to give a shit about Twitter metrics. He wasn't concerned with what the reader wanted. He was out there telling the stories that he thought needed to be told. And there's this great quote that's actually, it's my screensaver on my computer right now, that, because the reader wants food pictures, but also somehow democracy. And I am a huge believer in journalism, in the amount of technical expertise and, craftsmanship that has to go into being a journalist and producing good work. I like to think that I'm getting there, I like to think I got a really solid foundation to become one of these great journalists. But I also know that it's up to us as a community. If this is what we want, we have to find a way to make it happen. I've got ideas. I'm trying to schedule meetings with several outlets. I very specifically don't think this should be its own publication, because then you're trying to sell your news, then you are worrying about Twitter metrics, then you're worrying about building a website. I think you could do a collaboration with outlets that already exist. I don't have all the details about what that would take.
Right.
But piggyback on their platforms. You're producing work, content for them that they get for close to free, and you're able to do the work without worrying about Twitter. I think that's part of the equation. I think it needs to be funded through philanthropy, again, to get it away from the market, get it away from these market forces that have such a dominance in shaping journalism here. I mean, everywhere, but here in Minneapolis is what we're talking about. Again, nothing wrong with that, but it can't be the whole picture.
Can I introduce something? Because I wanted to save this to the end. Because I feel like it's only tangentially related and would distract from what you came here to talk about. But my problem with the new government structure, I know people have heard this over and over again from me. I say it all the time. Like, under the old structure, 13 city council members would face the public multiple times a week. They would face each other in public. They would disagree, make their case, come to consensus. All of this, or much of this, happening in public. And maybe it's messier than having one executive, one mayor make all these decisions. But it's easier to understand and know the who, how, and why of why these decisions are being made. And like under the new structure, and the reason this comes up is, and why this conversation is reminding me of that, is under the new structure, it's government by press release. Everyone in the executive branch is all out there agreeing with their boss in public. I don't know. This is just a much more difficult story to tell about city government now and help people understand. So this is a very relevant conversation for now in particular.
I actually reached out to ProPublica. They do a lot of, they've got like some local journalism initiative where they pair with local journalists to tell stories. So I wrote like, not a full pitch, but just like an inquiry. Hey, we're in Minneapolis. It's been in the news a lot lately. We're transitioning to this strong mayor system. Here's some red flags about the mayor. I think I would like to do a series, a year-long investigation, just tracking this transition to the strong mayor amendment, just seeing what happens, just trying to keep an eye on it, trying to get an understanding of what the shape of the government, like a lot of these things that we've been talking about. I wrote that letter just like this inquiry. Is this the sort of thing you'd be interested in? If so, how would I write that pitch? Just this little inquiry letter. And the response was like, the one thing I'm not seeing in your letter is like explaining what the interest is to a national audience.
No.
I mean, I get it. They're trying to do the best they can. There's millions and millions of stories that need to be told that aren't getting told, and they have to pick their focus. But it means that there's a gaping hole.
Are they the ones who've placed journalists locally, like around the country? Did they do that, or am I thinking of some other organization?
That's Report for America. I think you're thinking.
So ProPublica has not like placed people.
No.
In states across the country?
Journalists, one of the things they do, I think their main focus is a lot of nationally focused, in-depth reporting. They do great stuff. Like, again, I'm not trying to shit talk anybody here. They do great work, but then they have this local initiative where local journalists pitch them on a series that they would then do in collaboration with a existing publication.
Okay, good luck to you, Logan Carroll, on your adventure. And for listeners, if you learned one thing from this episode, I hope it's
Blame the mayor, because he's in charge.
That's really all the context you need for Minneapolis and local government right now.
He is. He's not in charge of the press. I mean,
it's true.
I mean, is he? No.
I can't blame him for how long this podcast is. Hopefully people made it to the end.
Hopefully. Yeah, right. I hope they made it to my pitch.
Yeah, I hope they got to like the call to action. That's the most important part. Maybe I can fix it in editing.
Yeah, so if people want to reach out to me, I think email is you can either reach out to John, he can forward it to me, or you can write me at loganccarroll@gmail.com. That's 2 C's, 2 R's, 2 L's. loganccarroll@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter. I got one of the reasons I love this quote about not giving a shit about Twitter is because I really hate Twitter. I hate it. Love to not worry about it.
I love it. I'm shedding so many tears about how it's just imploding. I know some people are taking great pleasure in how it's imploding. I'm like, oh, this is not good for me.
I'm kind of hoping I never have to worry about it.
I've invested way too much in Twitter.
But I know that it's really destructive. What's that? I'm sorry.
I've invested way too much into Twitter as like how I communicate to the world, and it's coming back to haunt me at this point.
Do you know Popular Information? It's like a newsletter, journalistic newsletter. They're really focused on national stories. They just, in their most recent one, which, I mean, they're great. They're really phenomenal. In their most recent one, which was all about how right-wing groups are masquerading as local citizens groups to fight climate change initiatives. It was really good. And then at the end, they were like, also Twitter's imploding and we've lost nearly 14,000 followers, and that's like the major way that we get that people learn about us. So it's fucking Elon Musk, man.
Yeah. I thought he was a smart man. He's not a smart man. He's demonstrating time after time. Okay. This has been the Wedge Life Podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. My guest has been Logan Carroll. Go find Logan. Email him if you can assist him in his
Or
journey.
find me on Twitter. That's what I was trying to say. Find me on Twitter, too.
And find Logan on Twitter. And thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.